Oops. And there we go. All right. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to the second Saturday seminar series. I'm Susan Jones, and here with me today is Charles D. Ferdinando at the Warm Animist Museum. While we were preparing for this 2024 edition of History La Plata, which is available, it came out on May 26th in the Durango Herald. We've got copies available here at the museum if you want to grab a hard copy, and it's also available on our website. So you can download the PDF or you can look at it online. While we were doing that, we uncovered so many stories in our research that one publication, one exhibit, one webinar just isn't going to hold them all. This year's theme is Front Lines to Home Front, La Plata County in World War II. And June 6th, just the other day, was the 80th anniversary of D-Day. And I hope everybody saw at least a part of the moving tribute in Normandy to those who sacrificed so much for our freedom. Seeing it really confirmed to us that our theme was appropriate this year. We've received some wonderful feedback on History La Plata. Thank you to those who took time to write or to drop by. And, also in our research, we found a lot of parallels between what was going on in the world leading up to World War II and today. Well, last month, we looked at the front lines and told the stories of some of those who served. And that video is available on our website, animistmuseum.org. You click on events, then past events, and scroll down and you'll find it. And today we're going to delve into some of the home front stories. Before we jump in, as usual, some quick Zoom housekeeping. We're using Zoom's webinar feature, which means that you're all muted and your videos are off. At the bottom of your screen, and you may need to mouse down to see it, there are a couple icons. To minimize distractions, we've disabled the chat function. If you have an immediate issue or question, please click on the Q&A and we'll be monitoring that. At the end of the talk, we'll open up for questions. You can either type them into the Q&A at any time and we'll answer them at the end, or you can click on the little hand icon and we'll allow you to unmute and ask your question. Now, if you're in the classroom today, hold your questions. Once we answer all the online questions, we'll come downstairs and answer any questions in person. We'll post the questions and answers in the show notes so nobody will miss anything. This session is being recorded and you will receive an email in 24 hours with a link to the recording and links. Okay, our story starts before December 7th, 1941, that day in infamy when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and brought the US into the war. Real quick, some very high-level background. World War II officially started on September 1st, 1939, when Nazi Germany attacked Poland. Britain and France, honoring their pledges to Poland, declared war on Germany. But for a time after the attack on Poland, there was a period of relative calm called the Phony War. That was over on May 9th, 1940. At the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was our president. And at the time, the US was staunchly isolationist. The memories of what they called the Great War, or what we know as World War I now, were still fresh, and Americans did not want to get involved in another European conflict. Congress even passed neutrality laws in the 1930s, forbidding the sale and shipment of arms to any belligerents. But Roosevelt, who led the country out of the Great Depression, recognized the threat that Hitler and Nazi Germany represented to the world. He knew in the spring of 1940 that the US would eventually get involved, but the US was in no way prepared for war. There was no munitions industry. The Army ranked 18th in the world. And Roosevelt set about changing that. But first of all, he had to get reelected. The election of 1940, he ran for an unprecedented third term, which was constitutional at the time, but is not anymore. That year, he beat Wendell Willkie with 55% of the popular vote, 449 electoral votes in 38 states. Once he was safely in office, Roosevelt initiated the Lend-Lease program, which allowed the US to send aid to Britain and later to the Soviet Union and China, who were our allies at the time. Now, to support this program, the defense industry needed to gear up, and we're going to talk about how that affected the La Plata County home front. So our focus today is on the home front. Roosevelt knew that without hard work and sacrifice on the home front, the war could not be won. He started what were known as his fireside chats in 1933. These were a series of 30 incredibly popular radio addresses to the American people. On those nights, usually everybody in the United States was sitting in front of their radio without benefit of recording in those days. And this quote from his April 1942 address assured his listeners that their work on the home front was as vital to the war effort as those who were serving on the front lines. And then Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7th, and that changed everything. On December 11th, just 4 days later, here in La Plata County, a defense rally was held at the Smiley Junior High. It was attended by over 1,200 men, women, and children, crowding into the auditorium and gymnasium of the building. Some of you might recognize the name Judge James Noland. He was the chairman of the Civil Defense Council here in Durango. He spoke at the defense rally and urged citizens to join up. Mayor John Frankhauser was there. The Durango High School band played the Star Spangled Banner. Recruiters for the Army and the Navy made their pitches, and everybody in La Plata County got ready to support the war effort. Patriotic citizens were urged to join the Civil Defense Council. Applications like the one that you see on the left were printed in the newspapers. This one is from the Durango Herald Democrat, and it was printed on December 11th, the day of that big rally. Some people became air wardens, and the air armband that you see on the left is from our collection, was used by a member of the Pingree family. Now, the volunteer air wardens were recruited and trained to enforce blackouts and prepare their neighbors in case of attack. They learned to identify enemy aircraft by the shape using flashcards or specially built models, one of which we have in our exhibit that we just opened. But fortunately, other than some Japanese balloon bombs that made it across the Pacific Ocean and killed 5 people in Oregon, there were no attacks on the American continent during the war. But one of the first things to hit home was rationing. The United States government realized early on that mobilizing for war would require vast amounts of certain products, including rubber, gasoline, textiles, metals, and of course, foodstuffs. To ensure a fair distribution of these products, a system of rationing was put in place, starting with tire rationing that was announced in late December 1941, and put into place in January of 1942. New automobiles were rationed in February 1942 as the car industry geared up to make tanks and jeeps to go overseas. And these rationing rules were going to be in place until the end of the war in August 1945. The first thing to be rationed again was tires, since a huge portion of the world's rubber supplies came from Malaysia and the East Indies, and they were controlled by Japan. And Japan needed that rubber too, so they weren't letting it out. The US government had started to amass a reserve supply of rubber starting in 1940 when Roosevelt kind of realized what was going on. But after Pearl Harbor, they realized it was not nearly enough. Synthetic rubber had been invented, but the plants needed to produce it in the necessary quantities were not going to be online until early 1942. So tire rationing hit home, and A.M. Camp, the son of A.P. Camp of the First National Bank fame here in Durango, was the administrator of tire rationing in La Plata County. And as you see, the quota for La Plata County in January 1942 was a whole 52 tires. At the time, the county population was about 15,000 people. So 52 tires wasn't a whole lot. And on the left, you see that we have a copy of one of the forms that you needed to fill out if you wanted new tires. And it had all kinds of questions and why do you need it and who are you and so on and so forth. And you could fill it all out and hope you got some tires, but who knows until the war was over. Many foods were scarce, especially sugar, because sugar was used to make industrial alcohol that was used to make smokeless powder used in artillery. And that industrial alcohol was one of the components in synthetic rubber. Sugar was the first food to be rationed in May 1942. A very complex, ever changing rationing system was put in place. Everybody was issued a ration book with stamps that were necessary in addition to cash to buy the food that you needed. Um, Plastic tokens, and you see here the red and blue tokens, they were used for change for ration stamps. Coffee was added to the ration list in November 19, that was in 1942. And then the next spring in March of 1943, meats, cheese, processed food, butter, and cooking oil all followed. People were encouraged to grow their own foods in victory gardens and to do what they could to alleviate the problem. Now, all this rationing and pricing was overseen by the Office of Price Administration, or OPA, and a lot of local volunteers helped to administer the OPA requirements here in La Plata County and throughout the United States. That food rationing was in place until the end of the war, but sugar rationing continued until June 1947. These ration books were those of the Sowens book, the family. They were kept safely in this little envelope from the Durango Mercantile, and they were treated worse than cash, or they were more precious than cash, because if something happened to them and you lost your ration books, it was, and your stamps, it was really hard to get them replaced. Starting in February 1943, shoes were added to the rationing list. Again, rubber and these were the soles, and leather were in short supply. We've talked about the rubber. The leather was needed for boots for servicemen and women overseas for their uniforms, and the leather flight jackets that flight crews would wear. But because a lot of those planes were flying at a high enough altitude without climate control inside, so they were pretty cold. So all the crews needed to have leather flight jackets. Now you could only purchase 3 pairs of shoes a year at first, and later that tightened to only 2 pairs of shoes. It was really tough for growing children because there weren't any allowances for that, and families would work together and share and as they say, make do and mend. Only 4 colors of shoes were permitted: black, white, brown, and army russet. And two-tone shoes were prohibited. Now, these boots belonged to Army nurse Eleanor Pingree. She was stationed in England, and I guess she was pretty lucky because these boots that we have in our collections were barely worn. And to purchase your shoes, you needed an airplane stamp in your ration book. Now, providing uniforms and footwear for the armed forces required massive amounts of wool, cotton, and leather. So the War Production Board mandated that the clothing industry cut back fabric use by 15%. Any fancy trim on clothes disappeared. Cuffs, wide lapels gone, shorter skirts, and straight rather than pleated skirts. Pleated skirts just used too much fabric. Even two-piece bathing suits were encouraged to save fabrics, and that's ultimately where the bikini came from, named after the Bikini Atoll, where an atomic bomb was tested right after the war. Everybody was encouraged to make do and mend with the clothing that they had on hand. Now, this is an example of the rationing requirements. The newspaper printed these regularly to keep up with the ever-changing and totally confusing instructions for rationing. So this came out in late 1943 because they're talking about Ration Book 4. Book 4 was distributed late that year, and Book 4 was the last of the rationing books to be released, and it was in effect until August 1945. So here you see what stamps that you need for meats, fats, cheese, canned milk, processed food. They also got your shoe stamps, your gasoline, and your tire eligibility. So the newspaper did try to keep up with it, but it must have been really confusing for a family, especially a big family, to keep up with everything. Now, beyond rationing, the one thing that was going on in La Plata County was raising money to pay for the war. Um, to do so, the United States held 8 bond drives between November 1942 and December 1945. And this picture, this wonderful picture of on the left of the parade that's on Main Avenue, they're going past the Graydon Mercantile right there. We believe that this image was from a war bond parade in April 1943, held here in Durango. So what you would do is you would buy bonds that would you could cash in for $25, and the bonds were purchased for $18.75. And what was really wonderful is that everybody could be part of it. You bought stamps in 10-cent increments. So you filled in $18.70 worth of 10-cent stamps, and then you gave them a nickel along with the book like this that you filled out with all your stamps. And you could turn that in. And after the war, these could be cashed in, and families were encouraged to buy bonds and then save that money and cash them in for household appliances and new cars once the war is over. So I encourage people to make do and mend with what you've got, and give people the hope that when the war is over, you could get the new things that you want and need. La Plata County residents did their part, and they bought war bonds. Some say one of the reasons that the victory ship SS Durango Victory was named for Durango was because of the outpouring of support for war bonds by La Plata County residents. That's one theory. Another theory was in Durango or in La Plata County, we had one of the highest per capita rates of servicemen signing up. And that's why the SS Durango Victory was named that. But whichever it was, still, we know La Plata County did their part. They bought bonds, they rationed, they signed up. They did everything they could to support the war from the home front. Now I get into a little bit more about, exactly what was going on. The Rio Grande Southern Railroad, or the RGS, is one of everybody's favorite narrow gauge railroads. We've talked about it before we've got a webinar on it, and we have a little exhibit in the main gallery on the RGS as well. It was originally built by Otto Mears and completed between Durango and Ridgeway in 1891. That little railroad supported the mining camps between Durango and Telluride, including Placerville, Ophir, and Rico. The 1893 silver panic proved absolutely disastrous for the railroad, but the RGS tenuously held on because it was so important to the people on the west side of the county and in the Montezuma and San Miguel counties. So if you haven't already watched Joanne Smith's video oral history, do check that out on her website. Joanne grew up in the Rico Depot, and she talks a lot about the Rio Grande Southern and its role in World War II. So the picture on the left shows an RGS freight train headed west over the Animas River, and we just love that picture. But as you see on the right, in 1941, the railroad was in dire straits, as you can see from this newspaper article. And it looked like it was about to be the end, but that's where Betty Pellet stepped in. Now, Betty Pellet is one of the more incredible characters to come out of Southwest Colorado, but she's kind of forgotten these days. So we were really excited to retell her story, since it is entwined with perhaps the reason that La Plata County was so important in World War II. And Charlie's going to talk more about this. Betty wrote an autobiography called That Pellet Woman, which tells her story. Basically, in 1940, Elizabeth Betty Pellet was elected to the Colorado House of Representatives, the first woman representative from the Western Slope. Her husband was a mining engineer named Bob Pellet. He brought Betty, she was born in Connecticut and was actually a Broadway actress and silent film actress. And it's just amazing. They fell in love, and he brought her to this remote mining camp of Rico in 1920, which must have been a total mind-blowing experience for her. But tagging behind her husband, she learned the mining business, and she helped him run their mining operations in Rico during the Depression. They were able to keep a full crew employed at one of their mines through the worst of the Depression, totally benefiting the local economy. And then her concern for Rico's children, even though she had none of her own, precipitated her initial foray into politics. And she went on the school board. And from there, her success encouraged her to run successfully for state office. And Betty was a delegate to that 1940 Democratic National Convention when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was nominated to run for that unprecedented third term. Always keeping her constituents in mind, she represented their concerns in the face of the coming war. That year, in 1940, this is a great story. There was a large surplus of pinto beans, which of course are a staple crop from out by Dolores County. Now, Betty introduced the pinto beans to the Army, the Navy, and the Lend-Lease program. And she'd send them samples of pinto beans and different recipes, and that generated contracts. She got pinto beans on the Army and Navy's menus, and even sent them to England, which I'm sure they kind of wondered about that. But then maybe they cooked them and found out how wonderful they are. So she generated contracts that way that helped the farmers in her area. She knew that with the war coming, beyond pinto beans, metals, including vanadium, copper, lead, and zinc that were produced by the Rico mines were going to be critical to the war effort. But the means of transportation that brought those metals to the processing plant in Durango, that was the Rio Grande Southern Railroad, was in jeopardy. So, with letters of support from the Colorado senators, the Colorado Mining Association, the Office of Production Management, even the Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes, Betty headed off to Washington, D.C. in January of 1941. Her hope was to keep the railroad alive with a $65,000 loan from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and also to keep it alive with guarantees of mail contracts from the U.S. Post Office. Now, as it turned out, there was a little narrow gauge railroad in South America that was serving mining camps producing copper, lead, and zinc. And they got a loan from a Lend-Lease agreement. So she used that as a precedent to convince the White House to go to the RFC, or that Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and to the post office, and just in time agree to give the money necessary to the receivership judge. The RGS was saved because of Betty's efforts and became even more critical for the transport of uranium yellowcake for the development of the atomic bomb. And Betty went on to serve in the Colorado House of Representatives for 16 more years and passed away in Rico in 1976. So it's so fun to share her wonderful story. And her efforts helped to save the Silverton branch of the Denver Rio Grande Western. And now I'm going to turn it over to Charlie.
Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, as Susan mentioned, the saving of the Rio Grande Southern Railroad was a huge accomplishment for Betty Pellet. But as she said, the Silverton branch of the railroad was also threatened. The mines had been shut down for most of the Depression, and the Silverton branch of the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, their revenues were down. And the government saw this as a losing proposition. And they had their eye on all of this railroad equipment to be sent up to Alaska. They were worried about a Japanese invasion of Alaska. And so they were trying to beef up defenses up there. And one of the ways to do that was to improve the operations of the White Pass and Yukon Railroad. So they were looking for railroad equipment here on the mainland that could be confiscated or appropriated by the federal government and sent up to Alaska. So again, they had their eye on the Rio Grande Southern because, again, if it went into bankruptcy, they could just swoop in and remove all of that equipment and rail and ship it to Alaska. They had the same idea with the Silverton branch of the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. The other thing they had their eye on was that on the San Juan extension of the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, they had 10 newer locomotives, the K-28 class locomotives, which had gone into service in the 1920s. And they were the workhorses of the railroad in this part of the country. And because of their relatively new vintage, again, they thought those ought to go to Alaska. Well, the Silverton branch of the railroad was saved, but out of the 10 K-28 locomotives, 7 of them were requisitioned by the federal government and shipped up to Alaska. The other loss of railroad in this area was, again, because they couldn't get their hands on the Rio Grande Southern or the Silverton branch, the Silverton Northern Railroad, which ran out of Silverton, which had been an Otto Mears railroad, it then was taken by the government, and equipment, rail, etc., again, was sent to Alaska. So anyway, at the beginning of the war, the local railroads were threatened by the federal government, but they just saw this as all being underutilized, and it would have a higher use in Alaska. But as we got drug into the war, the demand for strategic metals opened up the mines again. And when the mines were open, again, the best way to move production of the mines to wherever they were needed was by railroad. And so it's a good thing that these railroads remained in operation. So I think Susan mentioned it a little earlier, one of the new things that they began to mine in this region was uranium. The uranium ore in this area, it's a carnotite uranium ore. It contains basically 3 elements. It has uranium, vanadium, and radium. And with the increase in the Lend-Lease program and production of other armaments and ships and so forth, there was a high demand for high quality steel. And vanadium was used by the steel industry to alloy steel for high quality steel. So anyway, uranium had been mined, uranium ore in this region had been mined since the 1890s. But in the early days, what they were recovering was radium, which was used to paint clock and watch faces that would glow in the dark. They really didn't have uses for the other. But then when they discovered that vanadium could be used to alloy steel, the steel industry, there was a big demand for vanadium, and more uranium ore was mined in this region. The new thing to come into use during World War II was uranium. Now, in the early days, the nuclear science was in its infancy. A lot of what they thought they could do was still theoretical, but they needed uranium to carry out experiments and eventually lead to the development of armaments. So anyway, one of the other important parts of the railroad locally was the 50-mile branch line from Durango to Aztec and Farmington, New Mexico. Um, and during the war years, the oil industry started to boom in northern New Mexico, and there were two oil depots at the rail yard in Farmington. And tank cars were used by the railroad to move crude oil from those depots to oil refineries on the other side of the Continental Divide. There was a large refinery in Alamosa for many years. But anyway, then uranium ore was discovered west of Shiprock, New Mexico, on the Navajo reservation, and they had to get the uranium ore from that mine to Durango. And so it was trucked from the mine to the rail yard in Farmington, and there was a loading facility there where it could be then shipped on to Durango. This picture that we're using to illustrate, this is a passenger train eastbound from Durango, headed for Alamosa. The name of the train, it was called the San Juan Express because, again, this was the San Juan extension of the railroad. This was regular passenger service and mail service between Durango and the points between Durango and Alamosa, Colorado. This was narrow gauge, and once the railroad reached Alamosa, you would then transfer to a standard gauge train to continue on the Denver and Rio Grande system. So this was still the major transportation link to this region. Anyone traveling in or out of this area, especially with tire rationing and gasoline rationing, etc., if you had to go to the Front Range of Colorado, you traveled by train. Now this train is made up, you can see there's 4 cars there. There would have been a railway postal car, a baggage car, and 2 passenger cars that made up this train. Now this, again, this is the line going from the south yard of Durango, headed towards Ignacio. But the tracks ran next to the Animas River. You can see the La Posta Road Bridge in the background there. And even further back at the base of Smelter Mountain, you can see the remnants of the smelter. And we'll talk a little bit more about the smelter there. But this picture was taken during the wartime, once after 1942, when the smelter had been converted over to only processing uranium ore. So again, the railroad was utilized by if young men, when they were drafted or if they enlisted and they were called up for physicals, they had to travel by train from Durango to induction centers on the east slope. So usually they went from here to Denver by rail. And then if they passed their physical, they would probably come back and wait until they got notice for induction into the Army or whatever branch of service that they had signed up for. So let's move on to the next slide. So here is a close-up picture of the rebuilt smelter. The smelter had basically been shut down for 8 years because of the Depression. Metal prices had gone into decline and demand went into decline because of the Depression. So many of the mines in the 1930s in this area were shut down, and there wasn't enough business to keep the American smelting and refining operation going in Durango. So in around 1938-39, American Smelting and Refining decided that there probably would never be another resurgence of mining in the area, and they decided to start dismantling their large smelter operation because they could make money by selling the tons and tons of metal to the scrap effort, which went into building ships and other armaments in the country. So anyway, they hired a demolition contractor from Denver to come to Durango and start to dismantle the smelter operation. And tons of scrap metal were shipped by the railroad out of Durango during the early years of that dismantling. One of the interesting things in the newspaper is that, again, the smelter had been shut down for 8 years, and people were commenting to the newspaper that it was wonderful seeing vegetation beginning to regrow on the face of Smelter Mountain, because as long as the smelter operated, the toxic fumes totally denuded the vegetation off of the face of Smelter Mountain. Well, in 1941, U.S. Vanadium Corporation steps in. They're looking for a site to build a processing plant close to where uranium ore is mined. And they come to Durango, and here we've already got a smelting operation. There's already some equipment there, and there was such a high demand for vanadium that U.S. Vanadium Corporation needed to begin production as quickly as possible. So they end up negotiating a lease with American Smelting and Refining to buy what's left of the equipment at the old smelter, and they began to retrofit the old smelter to only process uranium ore. Now, in the early days, they were, only telling people that they were going to be processing uranium, they were processing uranium ore, but the only product they were recovering would be vanadium for the steel industry. Well, because of the Manhattan Project and the top secret nature of it, you couldn't really say that we were also after uranium. But this picture here, obviously it's taken in the winter, and this is after 1942, when the vanadium, U.S. Vanadium had begun processing uranium ore. This is the rebuilt structures. And one of the other things on that site was in the slag, or the waste material from previous smelting operations, there were still minerals in there that had a value. So they did begin to reprocess some of that slag material to recover zinc and lead, but the main product was vanadium and uranium. So one of the managers for U.S. Vanadium was a man by the name of Blair Burwell, who had grown up in Durango. His family dated back to the founding of Durango, and Blair Burwell was the general superintendent for United States Vanadium Corporation. And I'm sure because he was a resident of Durango and knew about the existence of a smelter here, that's one of the reasons that U.S. Vanadium came into this area. Blair Burwell was, like I said, a native and a graduate of Durango High School. He then was a graduate of the Colorado School of Mines, and his knowledge of Durango and the mineral resources probably played a huge role in, like I said, bringing U.S. Vanadium Corporation to this area. And this southwestern Colorado and over into eastern Utah around Moab, Utah, this area produced over 90% of the vanadium used during the war years and the post-war years, along with uranium for the Manhattan Project and later the Atomic Energy Commission. And that continued clear up through the Cold War years. So if you're a local, you know that there's nothing left on the site of this processing plant. This plant operated and like I said, produced nuclear material for the Atomic Energy Commission clear up until 1963. At that time, they shut the plant down. They moved their operation down to Shiprock, New Mexico, because they had just opened a new mine in the Shiprock area, and they wanted a more modern plant closer to the source of the uranium. So this plant and all of the tailings and waste material were basically abandoned in 1963, and they just languished there until the 1980s, when this, along with other mine and mill sites in southwestern Colorado and eastern Utah, became a part of a Superfund cleanup project. And so that's why we don't really see anything there anymore. But the U.S. Vanadium Corporation provided a huge amount of employment for this area during the war years. In fact, they had trouble filling positions because, again, the shortage of manpower due to the draft and so many men going into military service. So a lot of the people that worked there, they had women that worked there along with men. The women mostly were secretarial type jobs, but older men and men with deferments or health issues could work at the smelter. There was a gentleman by the name of Art Wyatt, who later became a state representative from this area. He worked there at the plant, and in our exhibit, we have his photo name badge from the time he worked there. Christine Sowens worked there also. She probably worked in the secretarial pool. She also worked for the Forest Service. So anyway, let's move on to the next slide. So this was just sort of a little cartoon in the papers. These types of things were sort of propaganda, but this showed up in the Durango Herald Democrat in January of 1942. It's called Industry's Big Guns. And what it shows there is a manufacturing plant with big smokestacks, and they're belching lots of smoke. And as I mentioned, people had noted that vegetation was growing back on Smelter Mountain because of the closure of the old smelter. Well, people lamented when smoke was seen again coming out of the stack, because they felt that, again, the vegetation would all be killed off, and it was. So let's go on to the next slide. This is a great picture. It's taken on Main Street on the west side of the 1100 block of Main Avenue. And we've got two sailors there. Well, actually, three sailors, excuse me. One of them is Wally Mollett. And the buildings that you see in the background, you might be able to see the sign towards the left. It's the Herald Democrat newspaper office, and they've got a flag displayed in the front window. And then there's a number of buildings to the north of the Herald Democrat building, and these would become one of the local war industry locations. They were originally built as livery stables. And today in that block, you've got a fitness gym clear up at the north end in what had been the Model Tire building. And then there's a restaurant and several other buildings in those other buildings there. But we have a very interesting thing happen. A man by the name of J.A. or Jack Lee, he was John A. Lee, decides that Durango needs a war industry. He had come to this area in the 1920s. He was a graduate of the University of Colorado at Boulder. He graduated with an electrical engineering degree. He worked for Westinghouse when he graduated from the University of Colorado. And then he worked for the United States Department of Reclamation and was stationed up in Wyoming. And then in the 1920s, he gets a job with the Sunnyside Mine and Mill north of Silverton. And he becomes their chief electrical engineer for the mine and the mill. And in 1927, he's had enough of working up at Sunnyside, and he decides he likes Durango, and he comes to Durango and buys an electrical company. He buys the Rocky Mountain Electric Service, and at the time they did general electrical repairs. They did house wiring, anything to do with motors, all of that. Anyway, he buys Rocky Mountain Electric Service. So he's here as early as 1927. Well, he becomes very active in the Durango business community. He becomes a promoter of the San Juan region. And when Pearl Harbor occurs, he's a member of the Chamber of Commerce, and he realizes that everybody has to do their part for the war effort. So on June the 1st of 1942, there was an article in the newspaper, in the Herald Democrat, that was titled "Laverne McKelvey and Jack Lee Bring Home War Contracts for Durango Machine Shops." Contracts in the name of Jack Lee were made, and anyway, his idea was that all of the big manufacturers were supposed to start creating subcontracts to smaller manufacturers to make parts that would go into a larger product. And so Laverne McKelvey and Jack Lee went on a tour of eastern Colorado. They went to Pueblo first and then on to Denver, trying to convince big manufacturers in Colorado to give them some subcontracts for different parts. But they had no luck in Colorado. All of the big manufacturers on the east slope didn't want to give any business to anybody over here on the west slope. So they went on to Kansas and talked to some airplane manufacturers, and that proved fruitful, and they came back with contracts to make airplane parts. So in the July 8th, 1942 Durango Herald-Democrat, there was a news note that said, it was titled "Moving In." Jack Lee is busy moving equipment into the building just north of the Herald-Democrat and hopes to be established in his business of producing defense items sometime before the end of the month. The building itself is being rearranged and re-equipped, after which the machinery will be set in place. And so what he had done, he had gone around Durango and talked to all of the owners of machine shops, anybody that had any type of machinery that could be used for manufacturing. He put together sort of a cooperative. And the idea is that he would go out and get contracts, and then he would share them with the different owners of these machine shops. He even went as far as to, there was a machine shop in Cortez. The owner was retiring, and nobody was willing to buy it and operate it in Cortez. So he went over there and purchased all of the machinery and brought it back to Durango for his operation. One of the machinists in Durango that worked with him was a gentleman by the name of Archie Bodo, who was well known in the machinist trade. In September 1st of 1942, the Durango Democrat announces that workers are needed at once for the Durango Defense Parts Factory. Jack Lee, operating the Durango Defense Parts Factory, says he can use a lot more workers for part-time work. Pay for beginners starts at 40 cents an hour, and they become skilled as they work. He was willing to train complete novices. They didn't need to have any machinist skills. The plant makes hundreds of precision pieces and parts for airplanes. The lack of critical steel and aluminum keeps the plant on a part-time basis. And he went on to say that women have proved here, as in all defense plants, to be splendid workers on complicated machines, turning out tiny parts with precision. So again, 40 cents an hour doesn't sound like much, but the minimum wage at the time was 30 cents an hour. So he was paying a premium to get workers. And again, these were part-time positions which fit in with women's schedules, especially if they had a family at home. They could work evening shifts and so forth that wouldn't interrupt with what they were doing at home. He also employed older men who, again, were not of the age for the draft, and so forth. So this was very important. The Durango Defense Parts Company got an honorary production award in May of 1943. And that was only after the first year of operation. At that time, in May of 1943, he had 14 employees producing parts for aircraft. He had a swing shift that was inaugurated so employees could work at other jobs too, because again, there was such a labor shortage. The vanadium plant, some of the men worked at the vanadium plant during the day, and then they would pull a swing shift working, making airplane parts in the evening or into the night. Anyway, in May of 1945, there was an announcement in the Durango Weekly Herald that said 35 workers are affected here. An order for the immediate shutdown of Durango's only defense plant was received yesterday afternoon by Jack Lee, owner of the Defense Parts Company, which was located at 1140 Main Avenue. The cancellation results in the layoff of 35 employees who have been engaged in building wing parts for the A-26 bomber, medium attack bomber. Lee had formerly received word from the Douglas plant at Tulsa, Oklahoma, where the finished parts are sent. Anyway, so this was quite a letdown. He went on to say that the shutdown order came from the prime contractor at Wichita, Kansas. Also affected by the order was A.S. McCall of Animas City, who was in charge of an anodizing process for the parts. Once they were machined at Jack Lee's plant, they were sent up to Animas City, where they were these aluminum parts were went through an anodizing process to strengthen them. And it says during the 3 years of operation, the defense plant has turned out about 500,000 parts. At the time of the closing, the turnover was about 340 parts a day. Lee does not know whether his former production volume will be resumed, but the shutdown is expected to be temporary. So anyway, again, I mentioned that he employed a number of women and also men. Let's go to the next slide. This is a picture of the Douglas A-26 bomber. And again, there was a short article in one of the newspapers that described that the Herald Democrat had an exhibit of some of the various parts that were being manufactured in Durango in their window, and people could come by and see what local people were doing to support the war effort. The Douglas A-26 bomber was, it went into full production in 1943, but its first test flights were in July, on July 10th of 1942. They made some alterations to the nose and to some of the cowling around the motors because it wasn't getting enough air for cooling. But this plane went into full production in 1943, and 2,503 of this model plane were built. And some of these planes were used clear up until 1980, when they were finally taken out of service. Now, they made alterations during the Korean War and also during the Vietnam War. But this was a workhorse of the Army Air Corps in the early days, and later the Air Force. So again, on December the 29th, 1944, there was this news note in the Durango News that said, local plant makes parts for the A-26 plane. One of the most interesting displays is shown this week in the window of the news. It is of airplane parts manufactured by the John A. Lee Defense Parts Company of Durango. The display, labeled, consists of landing gear supports, lifting shafts, raw shaft stock, and various other parts that go to make up the Invader, which was the name of this A-26 plane. America's fastest bomber, the hard-hitting low-level attack plane, a swift little giant, the A-26. 25 people are employed at the Lee plant here, and they are doing a fine job. And again, this is 1944. The Invader, the A-26, Army officials say, is the workhorse that never gets tired. So again, one of the people, one of the women that worked in Jack Lee's plant was a lady by the name of Carrie Everett. She was a neighbor of mine for many, many years. And she said that this was her first job in Durango. She grew up on a farm, and she had married a rancher, and for a while they lived over around Chromo, and which is south of Pagosa Springs. But then when the war broke out, her husband had to go into the service, and they moved back to Durango, and again, there was a demand for labor. So Carrie said her first job in Durango was during World War II, working for Jack Lee in his machine shop making small airplane parts. She said after the war, she went to work for J.C. Penney, and she worked for J.C. Penney's until she retired. She was a very sweet lady, very unassuming. She was very patriotic. I knew her originally because she was always one of the election judges for the precinct that I lived in. And she got me to also work on elections in my precinct. So anyway, that's a little lead in to the Rosie the Riveter story. And Susan's going to continue with that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. We've talked a lot about Rosie the Riveter here, so we'll make this one quick. But Charlie knew Carrie's story, but didn't know the whole details. And after we did our Rosie the Riveter exhibit last year, Charlie started researching it, and this whole story about Jack Lee and his defense plant kind of fell into place just in time to talk about what the home front did for Durango. Um, Real quick, of course, Rosie the Riveters, we're very proud of them. At the right is Anne Wise Isgar, who grew up here in Animas City and attended the school that's now the museum. During the war, she went to California and worked at Northrop Aircraft, building the P-61 Black Widow armed night fighter. And then she came back and lived in Durango for the rest of her life and was a huge supporter of the museum. And thanks to Pat Emmett, we have this wonderful clipping in the center about her aunt Jean Estes and one of our favorite people, Barbara Bush's mother, Ruth Genscher Starr. They were both Rosies. They were welders at the Kaiser shipyards on Swan Island near Portland, Oregon. And of course, the Kaiser shipyards were where the Victory ships came from. The the SS Durango Victory didn't come from Portland. It came from Richmond, California, but there's still that connection. So all of these women and all of the people that we've talked about today really helped to fulfill Roosevelt's hope that there was one front and one battle, and all were privileged to be in action throughout the war. So finally, our exhibit on La Plata County in World War II opened officially today in the main gallery, and here's just a quick view of it. Downstairs, we've posted an honor roll of those who served, and we're actively collecting more stories. You know, we've got a notebook with some of the stories that we've got so far. It's a work in progress, and we're adding photos and more information as we go along. And all this is going to feed to a database that will be available for researchers in the future. Yeah, also downstairs, we've got an exhibit on the victory ships and the SS Durango Victory. So come on by, grab a copy of History La Plata if you don't already have one, and we'll continue telling this story. But questions? Any questions? Again, we'll anybody online, either raise your hand or type it into the Q&A, and we'll get those answered. And then we'll run downstairs and see if anybody has any in the classroom, and we'll put those up in the show notes when we post this video, probably later today. No questions? I'll watch the question box, so you still have time, but just real quick, some shameless self-promotion. Summer's here, even though it's not really summer yet, but it is hot, and museum visitation is definitely picking up. Next month, our second Saturday seminar series will feature Ed Horvat and his new book on La Plata County. It's part of the Arcadia Images of America series, and it's based on a lot of the photos that from the Animas Museum collection that Ed shares in the Durango Herald every weekend. It's going to be published July 8th. So that weekend, we're going to have Ed do a talk and a book signing. And somehow we're going to do it both online and in person because we expect it's going to be hot. So we're planning to do it outside since the classroom gets so cold, I wish, hot. So stay tuned. Copies of the book will be available that day for purchase. And watch our website in eBlast for more information. I have one more check. I don't see any questions. So finally, thank you for joining us today. To keep up with us, join us, become a member, visit our website for more resources, subscribe to our eBlast, follow us on Facebook, like us on Instagram. And if you'd like to see continued programming like this one, be sure to hit the donate button on our website. We appreciate your support and thank you for joining us today. Have a great weekend and stay cool.
Thanks, everybody.